My fiancée left me for another man, then had the audacity sent me an RSVP link to their wedding. So I clicked yes and showed up, and then 7 years together should have meant something. 7 years of shared mornings, late-night talks, inside jokes only we understood. How could all of that vanish in an instant? The moment I got down on one knee, watching her eyes light up as I slipped the ring onto her finger, I had thought we were on the same page. I had believed that this was the natural next step, that everything we had built together would lead to a future we had both wanted. Looking back, I should have paid closer attention to the small, seemingly insignificant things, the moments that didn't quite sit right but were easy to dismiss. We had met in graduate school, when we were both still trying to prove ourselves in a world that didn't seem particularly eager to make room for either of us. She had been the magnetic one, the type of person who could walk into a room and immediately own it, her laughter carrying over the noise of any crowd. I had been more methodical, the planner, the one who ensured deadlines were met and details weren't forgotten. It had worked well for us, her charm, my strategy. Together, we had built something solid, or at least, that's what I had believed. The proposal had been perfect on the surface, planned out meticulously, with every detail curated to be unforgettable. I had chosen a weekend away at a luxury resort in Santa Monica, a place she had always talked about wanting to visit, waiting until the final night to surprise her. The waiter had brought out a dessert plate with the words, "Will you marry me?" elegantly written in chocolate sauce, a moment straight out of a romantic film. She had gasped, covered her mouth with both hands, eyes shining as she nodded enthusiastically. The applause from nearby tables, the gentle hum of the ocean in the background, the way she clung to me as if she never wanted to let go. It had all felt like a dream, the kind that left you warm long after you had woken up. Wedding planning began immediately, and it didn't take long for me to realize that while she had wanted the ring, she wanted total control even more. Every detail became something she needed to dictate, from the floral arrangements to the font style on the invitations, brushing off my input with an absent-minded kiss or a quick, "You don't really care about this stuff, do you?" At first, I had chalked it up to excitement, to her wanting everything to be perfect, but as the weeks stretched on, something in the air between us shifted. She became more distant, retreating to the bedroom to take phone calls she suddenly didn't want me to overhear, silencing her notifications, turning her phone face down whenever she placed it on the counter. There were excuses. Work was stressful, wedding planning was exhausting, she needed space. But the warmth between us had begun to cool in ways I couldn't quite define. The first real warning sign had come late one night when I had been up finishing a report for work, my laptop's glow the only light in the apartment. Her phone had vibrated on the kitchen counter, a single message lighting up the screen. The name Marcus had appeared, accompanied by a preview of the text, "Can't stop thinking about tonight." My stomach had clenched, something cold settling deep inside my chest, but I hadn't touched the phone. Instead, I had waited, listening to the quiet sounds of her breathing from the bedroom, forcing myself to breathe evenly, to think logically. When she had come out to get a glass of water, rubbing her eyes sleepily, I had asked about it as casually as I could manage. She had barely even hesitated before laughing softly, brushing her fingers along my arm in that way she always had when she wanted to reassure me. Marcus was just a coworker, she had said, someone from her department who had been helping with a big project. The text had meant nothing, she had added, already turning back toward the bedroom, leaving me standing in the dimly lit kitchen with a tight knot in my stomach. I had believed her, or rather, I had wanted to believe her. 7 years together had to count for something, and trust wasn't something I had ever thought I would need to question with her. But trust only mattered if both people honored it, and it took exactly 2 months for my entire world to be ripped apart. It had started with something small, just like the text from Marcus had been, one of those moments that seemed insignificant until you viewed it with hindsight. She had missed a venue tour, something she had insisted she wanted to be at, sending a short text about how she had been caught up with work. It hadn't been unusual. She had missed things before, pushing off cake tastings and invitation sign-offs. But something about this time had felt different. When she had come home that night, Something about the way she had been acting had been off, her energy different in a way I couldn't quite name. She had paced the living room like she was working up the nerve to say something, fingers twitching like she wanted to reach for something to hold on to. Then, in a quiet, measured voice, she had told me she couldn't go through with the wedding. At first, I had thought she was having a panic attack, that maybe the stress of everything had finally overwhelmed her, that she just needed reassurance that we were solid. But then, she had looked up at me, eyes wide and hesitant, and said the words that had changed everything. "I'm calling off the wedding because I've met someone else." The silence that had followed had been deafening, an endless stretch of nothingness that had swallowed the air from the room. I had stared at her, unable to move, unable to even process what she had said. I had almost laughed because it had to be a joke. There was no way this was actually happening. But she hadn't been finished, hadn't even given me a second to absorb it before she twisted the knife deeper. She wasn't just leaving me. She had already gotten engaged to someone else. Marcus. The same Marcus who had been texting her late at night. The same Marcus who had supposedly been nothing more than a coworker. Everything after that had blurred together. Her explanations about how they had reconnected, how things between us had been over long before she had admitted it, how she had known for months that she wanted to be with him instead. But nothing had compared to the final blow, the absolute audacity of the last thing she had said before walking out of our apartment for good. "I really want us to stay on good terms, so I hope you'll come to our wedding." She had actually invited me to watch her marry the man she had been cheating on me with. That had been the moment where the shock had broken, where the grief had been shoved aside by something sharper, something darker. If she wanted me to be there, fine. I would go. The invitation arrived a week after I had forced myself to click yes on the RSVP link, a decision that had sent my friends into a frenzy of disbelief. The envelope was thick, obnoxiously elegant, embossed with gold lettering that practically screamed wealth and exclusivity, as if the event itself needed to be presented as something more than just another wedding. I had expected it to feel like a punch to the gut, like a final insult on top of everything else she had done to me. But instead, as I held it in my hands, I felt something closer to amusement. Tucked inside the invitation, almost as if she had known I would need one last push to actually show up, was a short handwritten note from Madeline herself, her delicate cursive as infuriatingly composed as ever. "I hope you'll come and understand this is the right path for me. Let's keep things amicable." The arrogance in those few sentences, the sheer certainty that I would just accept her actions without so much as a word, made something sharp twist deep in my chest. She truly believed she had done nothing wrong, that her choices were justified, that I was supposed to be the mature one and simply swallow it down like it was an inconvenience instead of a complete and utter betrayal. The fact that she thought she could dictate how I should react, how I should feel, only solidified my resolve to follow through with my decision to attend. If she expected me to quietly disappear from her life, to fade into the background while she paraded around with the man she had thrown everything away for, she was about to be very, very disappointed. When I showed the invitation to my parents, their reactions were as predictable as they were immediate. My mother, a woman who had spent the last several weeks barely restraining herself from marching over to Madeline's apartment to demand an explanation, went silent for exactly 3 seconds before launching into an impassioned speech about dignity, self-respect, and how attending would only give them exactly what they wanted. My father, always the quieter one, sat there shaking his head, muttering under his breath about how people didn't have any shame anymore, his hands clenched tightly together like he was trying to physically restrain himself from doing something drastic. Both of them thought I was making a mistake, that I would regret stepping into that room and allowing myself to witness the final act of this absolute disaster of a breakup, but I had made up my mind, and nothing they said was going to change it. The real surprise came when I found out exactly who Marcus was beyond just being a coworker, the full extent of how long this had actually been going on. A mutual friend, someone who had been trying to stay neutral but clearly couldn't keep the information to herself any longer, dropped the bombshell over lunch one afternoon, her voice laced with hesitation as she laid it all out in front of me. It turned out that Marcus had been in the picture for far longer than I had originally thought. Not just a convenient rebound, but someone she had been entangled with for months, possibly even longer. There had been whispers about their relationship at her office, moments where they had been seen together looking just a little too close for comfort, rumors that had circulated quietly among her colleagues before eventually making their way outside of work. The idea that I had been the last to know, that I had spent all that time completely oblivious while everyone else had been quietly watching my relationship unravel, made the humiliation burn even hotter under my skin. If I had been waiting for confirmation that attending the wedding was the right decision, that had been it. The financial fallout was another battle entirely, a mess that I had been left to deal with while she skipped off to her new life without so much as a second thought. The deposits, the contracts, the thousands of dollars that had already been paid for a wedding that no longer existed. All of it had landed squarely on my shoulders, despite the fact that she had been the one to walk away. When I finally brought it up, not even bothering to be polite about it, she had responded with a dismissive apology and a vague excuse about how her financial priorities had shifted, as if she wasn't in the middle of planning an entirely new wedding with the man she had left me for. The audacity of it, the sheer gall to act like I was being unreasonable for expecting her to take responsibility for the mess she had created, was almost laughable. She had made her choice, and now she wanted me to clean up the aftermath while she played the role of a glowing bride-to-be. As if that hadn't been enough, just when I thought I had reached the peak of what I could tolerate, I received a message from Marcus himself, a carefully worded attempt at diplomacy that read more like a thinly veiled warning. "I hope there are no hard feelings between us," he had written, as if this was some minor misunderstanding rather than an outright betrayal. "Madeline and I are really looking forward to the wedding, and it would mean a lot if we could all move forward peacefully." The implication was clear: don't make a scene, don't cause trouble, don't disrupt the image they were trying so desperately to maintain. It was almost impressive how neither of them seemed to grasp the reality of what they had done, how they had convinced themselves that their actions were justifiable, that I should be the one making an effort to smooth things over. I had considered replying, had even typed out a few different responses ranging from scathing to outright mocking, but in the end, I simply left the message on read. There was nothing I could say that would make them see themselves for what they truly were, and frankly, I had better things to do with my time than waste it on a man who had built his entire relationship on stolen moments and deceit. My friends, of course, had their own thoughts on my decision to attend, opinions that ranged from amused to outright horrified. Some of them thought I was insane, that walking into that wedding was equivalent to willingly stepping into a burning building, while others seemed to find the entire thing hilarious, already brainstorming ways to turn the situation into something entertaining. One had suggested I bring a date, a woman so stunning that it would leave Madeline seething in regret, while another had joked about creating a playlist of the most passive-aggressive songs imaginable and slipping them into the reception music. It was the kind of support I hadn't realized I needed, a reminder that while this situation had been devastating, it wasn't the end of me. The real test, however, had come a week before the wedding, when my phone had rung and her name had appeared on the screen, a name that still made something in my chest tighten despite everything she had done. I had hesitated for half a second before answering, my voice as neutral as I could make it, waiting for her to speak first. She had been awkward, clearly trying to gauge my mood, before finally asking the question I knew had been weighing on her since she had sent the invitation. "Are you really coming?" she had asked, her voice laced with forced casualness, like she wasn't entirely sure if she wanted to know the answer. I could hear it, the slight waver in her voice, the unspoken concern that I would somehow ruin her perfect day, that I would make her look bad in front of the people she was trying so hard to impress. She had gone on about how she hoped I wouldn't make things uncomfortable, how she wanted everything to go smoothly, as if my presence alone was a threat to the narrative she had constructed. It had been almost satisfying, listening to the way her voice had tightened, to the way she had carefully avoided any real apology, to the way she had tried to frame everything as if we were just two people who had grown apart rather than two people whose relationship had been destroyed by her selfishness. I had kept my response short, offering her no reassurance, no comfort, nothing that would make her feel any better about the choice she had made. "Don't worry," I had said simply, my voice calm, steady. I wouldn't miss it. The wedding day arrived much faster than I had expected, and as I pulled my car into the parking lot of the estate they had chosen for their venue, I took a long moment to sit there, staring at the building in front of me. The place was extravagant in a way that felt forced, the kind of venue people booked when they wanted to prove something rather than celebrate something real, a carefully curated backdrop for social media posts rather than a reflection of actual love. The sight of it only cemented what I had already known deep down, that this entire event wasn't about commitment or partnership, but about image and appearances, about ensuring that Madeline got exactly what she wanted without having to acknowledge the wreckage she had left behind. I stepped out of the car, adjusting my suit as I walked toward the entrance, feeling the weight of the moment settle heavily onto my shoulders. It wasn't nerves exactly, nor was it regret, but something in between, a strange mixture of anticipation and detachment, as if I were about to watch a play where I had been cast in the role of the quiet observer rather than the leading man. The second I entered the venue, I felt the shift in energy, the subtle but undeniable ripple of recognition that spread through the crowd as people noticed me. Conversations quieted, eyes darted toward me before quickly looking away, and a few guests exchanged hushed whispers, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright discomfort. I had expected it, of course, but seeing it happen in real time was something else entirely, like watching a slow-motion car crash that everyone wanted to pretend wasn't happening. The first person to approach me was one of Madeline's cousins, a woman I had always gotten along with, though I could tell from the hesitant way she smiled that she wasn't entirely sure how to greet me under these circumstances. She made small talk, asking about my job and whether I had been keeping busy, clearly trying to steer the conversation toward neutral ground. But beneath it all, I could see the pity in her eyes, the way she was carefully avoiding any mention of the reason we were both here. It was the same with a few other guests, people I had known for years who suddenly didn't seem to know how to speak to me, as if they thought I might spontaneously combust if they said the wrong thing. Then, finally, I saw them. Madeline appeared first, weaving her way through the crowd with the same effortless grace that had always drawn people to her, smiling at guests, thanking them for coming, acting every bit the perfect bride. But the moment her gaze landed on me, something flickered across her expression, something quick and barely noticeable, but there nonetheless. A flash of uncertainty, a split second of discomfort before she smoothed it away and continued forward. She was radiant, undeniably beautiful in the way she had always been, but there was something else beneath it, something just slightly off, like a performer who wasn't entirely convinced by their own performance. Marcus was right behind her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, his posture confident, but his eyes flickering toward me with barely concealed unease. He was exactly as I had pictured him, the kind of man who carried himself as if he had never had to second-guess a decision in his life, as if he had never once considered that he might be the villain in someone else's story. But there was tension in the way he moved, in the way his fingers curled slightly against the fabric of Madeline's dress, in the way his jaw tightened as they reached my side. "Daniel," he said, nodding in what I assumed was meant to be a show of civility, though it came off more like an obligation than anything else. "I'm really glad you could make it." There was no sincerity in his voice, no genuine warmth, just the forced politeness of a man who had gotten exactly what he wanted, but still somehow felt the need to act as if he were being generous. I could have said many things in that moment, could have pointed out the absurdity of his words, could have reminded him that I had only been invited because Madeline had been desperate to maintain some illusion of peace, but instead, I simply smiled and returned the nod. "I wouldn't have missed it," I said, keeping my voice light, watching as a flicker of something crossed his face, something I couldn't quite place but that made satisfaction curl in my chest. Madeline, for her part, seemed determined to keep up appearances, launching into some pre-rehearsed speech about how wonderful everything had turned out, how she hoped I was enjoying myself, how important it was to her that we could all be here together without any hard feelings. It was so artificial, so carefully constructed, that I almost had to admire her dedication to the narrative she had built, to the idea that she had somehow handled this entire situation with grace rather than selfishness. I played along, nodding at all the right moments, offering just enough conversation to avoid making a scene, but I could tell from the way her fingers tensed around the stem of her champagne glass that my presence alone was enough to unsettle her. She had expected me to fade quietly into the background, to disappear and leave her to her perfect new life without ever having to confront the reality of what she had done. Seeing me there, standing tall, unshaken, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of knowing she had truly hurt me, was something she hadn't prepared for. The ceremony itself was uncomfortable in a way that I couldn't fully explain, the kind of event where everything looked flawless on the surface but felt strangely hollow beneath it. Marcus stumbled over his vows at one point, his voice catching in a way that made Madeline's expression tighten for half a second before she forced a reassuring smile. The guests clapped at all the right moments, cheered when they were supposed to, but there was an underlying stiffness to it all, a feeling of tension that no amount of well-placed decorations or expensive champagne could fully mask. At the reception, I kept my distance, watching the evening unfold from the sidelines, sipping my drink as I observed the cracks forming in real time. It wasn't anything obvious, nothing anyone who wasn't looking for it would have noticed, but it was there, in the way Madeline's smile faltered slightly when she thought no one was watching, in the way Marcus kept glancing toward her with something that looked almost like doubt. Then came the speeches, a series of carefully curated toasts filled with saccharine words and polite half-truths, each one more insufferable than the last. When it was my turn to speak, having been given the opportunity as a supposed gesture of goodwill, I kept my words brief but deliberate, making sure that every syllable carried the weight of unspoken truths. Weddings are about celebrating love, about standing in front of the people who matter most, and making a promise that you intend to keep, I said, letting my gaze linger on Madeline for just a second longer than necessary. I truly hope that promise means as much today as it will years from now. There was silence for half a second, a brief, almost imperceptible pause before the guests broke into polite applause, before Madeline's smile twitched just slightly at the edges, before Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I sat back down, feeling something settle inside me, a sense of finality that I hadn't expected. Whatever happened from this point forward, whatever choices they made, whatever consequences they faced, it was out of my hands. But as I glanced around the room, taking in the forced smiles, the careful performances, the undeniable tension simmering just beneath the surface, I realized something else. The cracks had already started forming, and sooner or later, the entire facade was going to collapse. The longer the night stretched on, the more apparent it became that this wedding, no matter how flawlessly staged, wasn't the fairy tale they had wanted it to be. It wasn't anything obvious at first, nothing anyone could outright point to as a moment where the illusion fully shattered, but it was in the details, the small missteps, the awkward glances, the stiffness in the way they interacted when they thought no one was watching. Madeline, always so careful with her presentation, had started slipping, her laughter a little too forced, her smile a little too strained, like she was playing a part in a script that wasn't quite coming together the way she had envisioned. Marcus, for all his confidence, kept adjusting his cufflinks, shifting in his seat, throwing glances toward her that didn't quite read as adoration but as something closer to apprehension. I watched it all unfold from a distance, blending into the crowd just enough to avoid being the center of attention while still catching every uncomfortable moment. A few guests had stopped pretending that this wasn't an incredibly bizarre situation, their whispers no longer as hushed, their glances lingering on me longer than before, as if waiting for me to make a move, to give them something worth talking about. But I had no intention of giving them the dramatic explosion they seemed to be hoping for. No desire to provide Madeline and Marcus with the satisfaction of seeing me unravel in any way. My presence alone was enough to make them uncomfortable, and that was more than enough for me. The tension reached its peak when the wedding cake, a towering multi-tiered monstrosity covered in delicate white roses, suddenly collapsed during the reception. It happened so quickly that for a moment, there was nothing but stunned silence. The entire room freezing as the sound of fondant and shattered sugar decorations hitting the floor echoed through the venue. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a few stifled laughs from guests who had likely had a little too much champagne, and then all eyes turned to Madeline, waiting to see how she would react to this unexpected disaster. Her expression flickered between horror and barely restrained rage, her fingers tightening around the stem of her champagne glass so forcefully that for a second, I thought she might actually shatter it in her grip. Marcus, standing beside her, let out an awkward laugh, rubbing the back of his neck as if trying to diffuse the situation, but it was clear from the way Madeline didn't even glance at him that she wasn't in the mood for humor. A few guests attempted to offer reassurances, insisting that it wasn't a big deal, that it could be salvaged, but the damage had already been done, not just to the cake, but to the atmosphere, to the perfectly crafted image they had so desperately been trying to maintain. I caught snippets of whispers from around the room, quiet voices murmuring about how this had to be a bad omen, how maybe this wasn't the universe's way of celebrating their union, but of warning them. Superstitions spread quickly in moments like this, especially among the older guests who believed in signs, in fate, in things unraveling for a reason, and it wasn't long before the mood of the reception shifted from joyful to something much more uneasy. Madeline and Marcus disappeared for a while after that, slipping away from the main event under the guise of needing a private moment. But it didn't take a genius to figure out what was actually happening. The way Madeline had stormed off, her jaw set, her fingers curled into fists at her sides, had made it more than obvious that she wasn't just upset. She was furious. Marcus had followed, looking both resigned and exhausted, like a man who had already accepted that this wasn't going to end well for him no matter what he said. It didn't take long for the whispers to turn into something more substantial, for murmurs of a brewing fight to start circulating among the guests, for people to start exchanging knowing glances as they noticed the newlyweds' extended absence. When I stepped outside for some air, more out of curiosity than anything else, I didn't have to look far to find them. They were just around the corner of the venue, standing in the dim glow of an overhead light, their voices sharp and low, but not low enough to be completely unheard. "I told you this entire night had to be perfect," Madeline hissed, her voice dripping with barely contained frustration, her posture rigid as she gestured toward the reception hall behind her. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? People are talking, Marcus. They're laughing at us." Marcus exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples, his patience clearly wearing thin as he shot her a look that held more exhaustion than sympathy. "It's a cake, Madeline. It's not the end of the world. People aren't going to remember this as some huge disaster unless you keep acting like it is." She let out a sharp, humorless laugh, shaking her head, her hands gripping the fabric of her dress like she was physically restraining herself from saying something worse. "You don't get it, do you? You never get it. Everything needs to be controlled, everything needs to be managed, because if it isn't, then what's the point? Do you even care about how this reflects on us?" I could see it then, the exact moment Marcus reached the end of his tolerance, the moment whatever idealized version of Madeline he had fallen for started cracking in real time. His expression shifted, something dark flickering behind his eyes as he took a slow step back from her, arms crossing over his chest like he was suddenly reevaluating everything. "Maybe if you spent less time trying to control every little detail, you'd actually be able to enjoy your own wedding," he muttered, voice quiet, but sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Or is that too much to ask?" Madeline's lips parted slightly, caught between a retort and stunned silence. And for the first time all night, she looked genuinely unsettled, like she hadn't expected to lose control of the narrative quite so soon. Marcus didn't wait for her response, just let out a frustrated sigh before turning on his heel and heading back inside. leaving her standing there alone, fists clenched at her sides, chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. I didn't stick around to see what happened next. I had seen enough, heard enough, and whatever came after this wasn't my problem anymore. As I walked back toward my car, feeling the cool night air against my face, I realized that I hadn't felt a single pang of regret about attending. Not one moment of hesitation about witnessing the aftermath of the choices she had made. The cracks were already forming, the perfect image already splintering, and whatever foundation they had built this marriage on was weaker than either of them had wanted to admit. And sooner or later, it was going to collapse completely. A week after the wedding, I received an unexpected message from a mutual friend, someone who had attended the entire event and had been keeping an eye on things just as closely as I had. The text was short, almost casual, but the weight of the words carried something much heavier beneath the surface. "They cut their honeymoon short," she wrote, followed by a second message just a few seconds later, as if she knew I would need the additional context. Apparently, they had a massive argument a few days in, and Madeline wasn't exactly subtle about how pissed off she was. I read the words twice, then leaned back in my chair, letting them settle in a way that felt both expected and strangely satisfying, not in a petty way, but in the way that comes from knowing the universe has a way of balancing itself out. From the moment I had walked into that wedding, I had felt something off, a stiffness in the way they had interacted, a forced perfection in the way they had tried to present themselves. Now, it seemed that the carefully crafted image had barely survived a week before the first major cracks had started to show. It didn't take long for more details to trickle in, little fragments of information passed along through whispers and quiet conversations, each piece painting a clearer picture of what was unraveling behind closed doors. People who had once tried to stay neutral, who had once avoided talking to me out of some misguided sense of diplomacy, were suddenly reaching out, offering insight into just how fast things were deteriorating. A friend who worked in event planning mentioned that some of the wedding vendors had yet to be paid, that invoices had gone unanswered, and that murmurs of possible legal action had already begun circulating. Someone else, who had once been close to Madeline, let it slip that she had started venting to a few people about how marriage wasn't exactly what she had expected, though she had framed it in the kind of way that made it clear she was still trying to control the narrative. The more I heard, the more I realized just how much of her happiness had always been tied to perception, to how things looked rather than how they actually felt. The wedding had been her masterpiece, the thing she had spent months curating down to the finest detail. But now that it was over, now that the excitement had faded and all that was left was the reality of a commitment she had made, it seemed that reality wasn't as glamorous as she had convinced herself it would be. And then, just when I thought I had heard it all, just when I had settled into the comfortable knowledge that I was completely removed from their mess, I received a message that made me pause longer than I had anticipated. It was from Marcus. At first, I thought I had misread the name, that my brain was playing tricks on me, because there was no logical reason for him to be reaching out, no explanation for why he would feel the need to speak to me after everything that had happened. But there it was, his name clear on the screen, followed by a message that was almost laughably vague, as if he couldn't quite figure out how to say what he actually wanted to say. "Hey, I know this is probably weird, but I just wanted to reach out and clear the air." I stared at the words, debating whether or not I should even dignify them with a response, whether there was anything to be gained from entertaining whatever weak attempt at conversation he was trying to initiate. Against my better judgment, I typed out a short reply, more out of curiosity than anything else, knowing full well that whatever he was about to say wouldn't change a damn thing. "What exactly do you think needs to be cleared?" The response came almost immediately, as if he had been waiting, as if this had been something weighing on him for far longer than he wanted to admit. "I just feel like things ended weird between us, and I don't want any lingering resentment." He paused for a few moments before sending a second message, one that felt like it carried far more weight than the first. "If I'm being honest, things haven't exactly been what I expected since the wedding, and I've been doing a lot of thinking." I laughed when I read it, not because it was funny, but because of how incredibly predictable it was, how utterly inevitable this moment had always been. The man who had been so sure of himself, so confident in the choices he had made, was already starting to see the cracks in the foundation he had built his life on, already realizing that maybe, just maybe, things weren't as picture-perfect as he had convinced himself they would be. I didn't respond, didn't give him the satisfaction of a back and forth that would allow him to shift some of his guilt onto me, to lessen the weight of his own regret by dragging me into whatever internal battle he was now facing. Instead, I put my phone down and went about my day, letting his words sit there unanswered, knowing that silence would say more than any response ever could. Not long after that, Madeline's social media presence started shifting in ways that were impossible to ignore, her carefully curated posts becoming more sporadic, the once constant flood of wedding and honeymoon pictures slowing to an occasional, half-hearted update. Then, almost as if she couldn't help herself, she started posting vague, cryptic messages, quotes about trust and betrayal, about disappointment and moving forward, each one more transparent than the last. It wasn't long before people started commenting, some asking outright if everything was okay, others subtly implying that they had seen this coming from the start. Then came the rumors, the quiet but persistent murmurs that suggested that Madeline had already spoken to a lawyer, that she had begun weighing her options before the ink on the marriage certificate had even fully dried. Someone in Marcus's own social circle let it slip that he had been staying at a friend's place for a few nights, that things at home had become too tense, that he had started questioning whether he had made the right choice. The people who had once congratulated them, who had once played along with the fairy tale, were now watching from the sidelines, waiting to see just how fast it would all come crashing down. I didn't feel sorry for him, didn't feel even the slightest pang of sympathy for a man who had willingly stepped into this mess, who had made his choices with full awareness of the damage they would cause. I didn't feel anything at all, really, except a strange sense of relief, an overwhelming confirmation that I had been right to walk away, that I had been right to let them destroy themselves without ever having to lift a finger. By the time another mutual friend reached out to let me know that their separation had become official, that Marcus and Madeline were no longer living together, that the divorce papers had already been drawn up, I found that I wasn't even surprised. The cycle had run its course, the inevitable conclusion had arrived, and whatever twisted version of happiness they had convinced themselves they were chasing had turned out to be nothing more than an illusion. And me? For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had finally, truly moved on.